Thanks for coming to Groovy Mobile Automation. So who am I? I'm the founder of a new startup called Agile Orbit. We do Groovy, Grails, consulting. We do mobile consulting as well as infrastructure automation. And we're based out of Minneapolis. So, Groovy Mobile Automation. That's probably 3 words you have not heard in the same slide before. So what is Groovy Mobile Automation, and what are we actually trying to accomplish with this talk? Well, first, we're looking to establish functional test cases written in Groovy and Spock that validate our mobile business functionality. So when I mean functional test cases, what I mean is the app is already built. It's already deployed, or it's already been built by your CI server or an IDE if you don't have a CI server, and you want to run the app in a device, an emulator or simulator, and test out functionality. This is not unit testing using, once you're in the IDE. The app is already built. We're looking to test the built functionality. Also, the second objective is we want a test suite that runs on multiple devices and platforms using Gradle. So there's lots of options for doing functional testing in one platform or the other, but getting a test case to work on multiple platforms without changing the test case is pretty cool, and it's very few people are currently doing this. So it's that's definitely the objective. Is we want to write one test case and run it on an iOS device and an Android device without changing the test case. And then we're going to talk about the third objective of automating the execution of our functional test suite. So the whole point of mobile automation is to build up a regression test suite. You want to build up your tests so you're running them every time you do a new release and your new functionality isn't breaking stuff that you already have for your users. So we want that has to be automated. It has to be running daily. So before we jump into the Groovy side of the things, we need to talk about what library we're going to use. The library that we're going to use is called Appium. So what Appium is think of it as the bridge between our test cases and the automation frameworks that we're going to run on the devices. So essentially, we'll get into the details here, but it's think of it as just it's that bridge that is taking the request from your Spock test and it's getting it to the iOS device or getting it to the Android device. It's an open source test automation framework. It can be used by native or hybrid mobile apps. We're primarily going to be talking about native apps in this talk, but there's no reason you can't use it with other things. It drives the iOS and Android apps using the WebDriver JSON wire protocol. So, WebDriver has pretty much become the standard here in mobile automation or automation in general. And this is taking that driver and making it work on iOS and Android. So you can check it out. It's just appium.io. It's all, like I said, it's open source, so it's on GitHub. So why would I pick this library to use with Groovy? There's tons of options. What are the real reasons for this? And there's 4 things here. You shouldn't have to recompile your app or modify it in any way to automate it. And this is actually a really important point. And we can get into this in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But essentially, I don't have to set up a test target. I don't have to set up anything new in my infrastructure or a new build in my CI servers or anything. I'm literally taking the same builds that I would give to a user, and I'm doing my functional testing with them. Number 2, you shouldn't be locked into a specific language or framework. Obviously, we're focused on Groovy in this talk, but you can actually use Appium with any language. You can use JavaScript, Ruby, whatever. Hopefully by this talk, I'll convince you to use Groovy with it, though. 3, a mobile automation framework shouldn't reinvent the wheel when it comes to automation. So, like I said in the previous slide, it's taking the WebDriver API and it's leveraging that standard that already exists, right? It's not just coming up with something brand new. It's taking what's already existing as a best practice and building upon it. And number 4, obviously, it should be open source, just like Groovy. So I'll talk about this a little bit. I'm going to dive into it here. So Appium is using the UI automation and UI Automator of iOS and Android directly. So that's how it's achieving using the same build that you would put on a device to run your functional tests. It's using the stuff that's already provided by those operating systems. Other mobile automation libraries are, they're another dependency that you'll include in your build. Like you'll add a new library in Xcode or add a new library with your Gradle build for Android. This isn't. This is using what already exists within the iOS and Android landscapes and is taking advantage of that. We already kind of talked about this a little bit, but a little bit more about WebDriver is it's providing that client-server protocol called the JSON wire protocol. So Appium is giving you a RESTful endpoint that you can then send commands to, which we'll do with Groovy and Spock, to then be executed on a device. So it can be used with any language. It's just a RESTful endpoint, and there's lots of different client libraries. The Java one, and in turn, with Groovy and Spock is great, but you can use it with anything. WebDriver is working to be a W3C standard, and it's taking that, like we talked about, and extending it with custom mobile things. So if you think about like the gestures you do on mobile, you swipe, tap, pinch, things that you would do on a typical mobile application. Appium takes the WebDriver specification and adds them to it, so you can do it. Number 4, this is something that it's interesting because in a lot of in the QA environments, it's not very common to use open source stuff at all. It's not like traditional development. And this is actually, when I did this for the first time and worked on it at a client's on a client site, it was interesting because it was the first time I really interfaced with a QA team. I've always just been more on the software side, development side, architecture, but when you go into the QA world, it's a whole different set of constraints or limitations. And I see somebody nodding my head. Quick show of hands, how many people have worked in a QA function in a big company, medium company? Just a couple, okay. Well, it's different, right? It's not development. The concept of software engineer of test is still relatively new in the industry, where you have people not working on the core project writing automated test cases, regardless of whether it's a website, a mobile app, or whatever. It's still a fairly new concept. But bringing something in open source like this is even more challenging. It brings in a set of reservations just like 5, 10 years ago that happened in development. But what I will say is that it's been my experience, and I've used a number of them, that many commercial open automation tools are very overhyped by the vendors and constantly under-deliver. There's lots of tools coming up in this space, and they will advertise drag and drop functionality and all this type of stuff. And I'll be the first to tell you that it does not work as you would expect. You are way better off bringing up your IDE and writing some Groovy and Spock code to do this, as opposed to trying to use a drag and drop tool from a commercial product. And obviously, we want to avoid vendor lock-in anyway, right? We don't want to have expensive contracts. So what are the alternatives? Like I mentioned, there's lots of stuff in this space. Based on the 4 criteria that we just outlaid, Appium is really the only one that meets all 4 of these criteria. So that's why it was chosen as the library to use. Architecture. So that's the library. Let's get into what we're going to build. This is what it looks like. You have your functional test suite, which is Groovy with Spock test cases. You're using the Appium Java client, which is a wrapper of Selenium. It includes JSON, Google's library, to communicate with that Appium API. And then we're going to use Gradle to build it. The Appium product itself, it's a Node.js library. It's serving up a RESTful endpoint like we talked about. And it's giving you that WebDriver API. It's giving you that JSON wire protocol that we're going to communicate with. And then within your Jenkins server, you can have fake mobile devices, right? Your iOS simulator or your Android emulator. Or you can have real mobile devices. You can actually have devices plugged in to your CI server. And I've actually done that. But we'll get into some other options a little bit later on. So this is what it looks like. This is the complete picture of Groovy mobile automation. So I mentioned the Appium Java client, and let's just talk a little bit more about this. I already mentioned the second point, includes JSON to talk to that Appium library, and it's a wrapper of Selenium 2.x. It's conforming to that JSON wire protocol, and it's providing all the usual Selenium features that if you've done traditional web automation you'd be familiar with, in addition to the new ones for mobile, like tapping, swiping, zooming, and so forth. So this is just another library that you'll just include in your Gradle file, and it takes care of making all this available to your project. So that's the architecture. We talked about the library. So now let's get to the question of, well, why use Groovy, Spock, and Gradle? What are we getting out of this? Well, the first thing that is obvious for probably most people at this conference is Groovy is extremely easy to learn. It's very easy to pick up. It has great IDE support, and especially for people who aren't traditional software developers. So like I said, the concept of software engineer of test is still fairly new in the industry. It's not that common. So it's got to be something that somebody can get up running quickly, right? They have to be able to jump in and start making progress. So having a IDE like Eclipse or IntelliJ that they can use is a huge benefit. Also, a lot of test engineers are already familiar with Selenium and using it with Java, just because that's kind of been the standard for web automation for a while now. So anybody who's already done that, they can jump right in with this and start using it. Spock, it helps keeps our tests organized. If you've ever written a Spock test, you know that you have the labels that you're organizing the contents of your tests under. And especially when it comes to stuff like this, if you think about a mobile application, you could be 10 screens into the app before you actually test a function, right? I log in, I click a setting, I enter some data, I go back, and then I do a search, right? Or I make a reservation or something like that. Your tests become quite large very quickly. So using Spock will help you keep those organized. And then Gradle makes the test suite and makes automating them very easy with a CI server. So it gives you all the things that you're very familiar with if you've ever used Gradle, all the things that you kind of take for granted now. But that's the essence of why we're using these technologies. It's easy for people to adopt to, keeps us organized, and gives us the benefits of Gradle. So one quick side note here, you might be asking, or if you've used Selenium in the past, what about Selenium 3? I've heard that they were adding support for mobile, or where is that at? Whatever happened to that? I feel like it's been an ongoing question for quite a while. Well, it's still a work in progress. I don't keep that many tabs on the project. I don't check in with the project that often, but I did just before the conference here, and the latest was it's still a work in progress. It's still moving forward, but it's going to be a big update for users. It's not going to be just a drop-in replacement for Selenium 2 users. It's going to take some work to get everything updated. And the big thing is, previously they were saying that as part of Selenium, they wanted to have the native mobile support. They have since changed that. They've dropped the Android and iPhone drivers and decided to pursue compatible libraries that are already available, like Appium. So, in summary, there's really no reason to worry about Selenium 3 coming out anymore because they've already kind of changed their tune. All right. So that's all fun, but let's actually get into some code. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm just going to show you a simple demo that we're going to test. Oh, actually should have gone forward one more slide. 2 more slides. First, this is our demo build file. It's just a straight Gradle build file. We're using 3 plugins, very simple. You can see we have our dependency on Groovy, Spock, and then this is that Java client for Appium. Then we're just going to pull in 2 system parameters, and I'll talk about those a little bit later on. They're not used for the first demo, but I'll get into those. And then the wrapper. So extremely simple, hello world, basically, Gradle file. So let's talk about what we're going to test. So the first thing we're going to test is an Android application. And I have Eclipse up and running here, so you can see what it looks like. And The functionality we're going to test, can you guys all see that? Maybe? Oops. The functionality we're going to test is we're going to bring up the application. We're going to, in Android terms, that's called an activity. Your first screen, every screen is called an activity. And we're going to create what's called an intent. An intent, to think of it as a way, is to pass data or values to another Android activity. So in this particular one, all we're going to do is we're going to grab the string value of a text field, and we're going to start up the other activity. And then we're going to, with this one, this is our second one, we're going to look up a Spanish name. Extremely simple demo, but we're just going to take a string, and we're going to look for the appropriate value in a map. And if that value exists, we'll just put it out to the screen. Otherwise, we'll just say usted, which is you in Spanish. So I can't say hi to the person, I'll just say hi you. The equivalent in Xcode. So iOS, obviously, it's Objective-C. So in this one, we have pretty much the exact same method, right? We have look up Spanish name, just the syntax is a little different. Otherwise, return usted. So this demonstrates a key point, though. In mobile, a lot of times, you don't have that much business logic in your application, but it might be duplicated on both platforms. And if you're using a hybrid framework, like PhoneGap or AppCelerator, stuff like that, you have one code base. But you'd still want to test on both platforms, right? There could be differences on iOS and Android. But in this instance, yeah, the functionality is actually duplicated on iOS and Android because they're straight native applications. OK, so let's jump in to our tests. So in here, I have an Android test case in IntelliJ. So this is our first look at Appium, using Appium. So this is a standard Spock test. You can see we're importing some stuff from the Appium library. We are then using some direct Selenium classes as well. Remember I said the Appium library pulls in Selenium as a dependency. So we are using a couple of those classes directly. And then we're just, we're extending the base specification that you are probably familiar with Spock. The first thing that we do is we are going to grab our APK file. So an APK file is, think of it as the executable for Android. If you're not familiar with Android, it's just like an exe or whatever. It's the executable that it's your compiled application. It's like a jar file. Next, we're going to create what's called a desired capabilities class. I have to create an instance of this class. And this is how you will set all the features that you want to use as part of this running instance that you're going to create. So we're going to use the Android emulator. We're going to set our mobile platform to Android. The app is simply our demo.apk file. So it's going to grab that from the file system, and it's going to put it on the emulator. And then right here, you can see we're creating a new URL to this right here on localhost port 4723/WB, whatever. This is Appium. So I'm literally just creating a connection to a server running on my laptop on port 4723. And then once I have that Appium driver, then we're set up, and then we can write our test, say hello in Spanish. So the other thing to note in this class is you can see I'm using a find element by class name, and it's specific to Android, right? So it's Android widget edit text. Then I'm going to find the button, and this time I'm doing something different though. I'm doing a find element by name. So I did this on purpose to kind of show the different ways you can write these. You can find elements by an ID, by a type, by an accessibility ID, or you can find them just based on the text that is displayed. So once I have those two things defined, I'll do an input, send the keys Bobby. I'll click the button. And then in my then block for the Spock test, I'm just going to find the element, see if it exists, hola Roberto. So our application should take Bobby, look in our map, and return the correct value. Here's the equivalent for Apple. everything's pretty much the same except a couple key differences. Here we have demo.app instead of demo.apk. Obviously, we have a completely separate binary. And you'll notice some of these desired capabilities are different. Obviously, the platform is iOS, and we're using the iPhone simulator. And we're going to do the platform version of 7.1, which is the latest. Well, it was the latest. It's not anymore, I guess. But we're using that same endpoint. So this is the key thing to look at, is we're using the same endpoint for Appium. So once again, it's setting up that REST interface, that JSON wire protocol. We send our instructions to it. Based on this Appium driver takes care of that for us. And then it does the rest. It knows how to call down to iOS and Android and use the appropriate automation frameworks on those platforms. So the test, say hello in Spanish, is once again very similar, but you can see this time we're using UIA text field. So that is the equivalent on iOS. That is the same thing as what we had in Android as Android widget edit text. Okay. And the Gradle file, we already looked at this in the slides, but you can see that it's exactly the same as we had in the slides. We just have our 3 dependencies, and that's pretty much it. Okay. So let's pull up. I already have my Android emulator running. And I'm using something called Genymotion. I just thought I would show this because it speeds up your mobile development incredibly. It makes your mobile development incredibly quicker on Android. If you're not familiar with it, there's a free version for one user, and I think you have to buy it for corporate pricing, but it is free for personal use. This is definitely the way to go when it comes to Android development. So you'll want to check out the Genymotion Android emulator. Okay, so this is Genymotion Android emulator up and running. This is a Nexus 5. And before I run this test, I want to just clarify, sometimes this gets people confused. Does anybody know the difference between an emulator and a simulator? The emulator for Androids, they're actually full operating systems. So this has an exact copy of Android KitKat running on it, on this Nexus 5. Genymotion under the hood is using VirtualBox to provide these. But it is a full copy of Android. It's not fake, it's the full OS. Whereas in iOS, you have a simulator. So in iOS, it's not a copy of a running iOS device. It's a program on Mac. It's just another program. And there's things that don't work, right? You can't use a lot of stuff, actually, on the iOS simulator. So that's kind of the difference. But OK, so you can see I'm in my demo test suite here. We have, this is just the root of that project in IntelliJ. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to run with the Gradle wrapper, and we'll just do tests. So I'm running the test command with Gradle. And it should do, I can't remember which one it does first. Oh, let's see. Oh, I forgot one thing, sorry. So right away, we get an error that says unreachable browser exception. And that's perfectly valid because I haven't started Appium. So let's start up Appium. Appium does provide a nice app to use on Mac, but it is a Node.js module. So on your CI servers, you're going to want to just set up Node and install this with npm. It's just the npm name is just called Appium. But there's a nice app for Macs that you can use to look at the logs and so forth. But I'm just going to launch it. And let's try this again. Hopefully we make it farther. OK, so it started my app on the Android emulator. Entered the name, hit send, Olo Roberto. One test completed. Now it should start the iOS one. So here's our iOS simulator. You can see it's using an iPhone, the iPhone with iOS 7.1, because that's what we specified. Hopefully the demo gods are with me. It never fails. You know, you can test it as many times before the talk. The demo gods are always, they always have a mind of their own. Let's try this again. Okay, what happened here? Line 23. All right, well, I'm not really sure why I just ran this before and cannot connect. Let me try this something else again here real quick. Make sure nothing is checked here. Try this one more time. You know, if it doesn't work, then I'll move on. Yes, you can. So Genymotion, so this is a Nexus 5, but you can, any VM that they've already previously created, you could set up as an Android virtual device, and it would be good to go. There we go. So I'm not really sure what happened the first one there, but it worked.
The first time it did not close the first session.
Maybe that's what it was. Yeah. Actually, that probably is what it was.
And maybe when you tested it before, did you do it like at the same time, like both of them, or just one individually?
I can't remember. I can't remember now, but
You hold the old session, and then it might be like waiting for.
yeah, that could have been the cause actually. But yeah, I'm glad it worked now. So there we go. Okay. So once again, that was an example of 2 Spock tests in one project using iOS and Android together. But what's the obvious limitations here? Well, we have a lot of duplication in our code, and you know it's not very clean here. And these tests kind of look ugly, right? This test right here, that looks pretty ugly. So we're going to try and clean that up. So the second demo is going to be something very similar, but what we're going to do is we're going to start writing our own helpers. So in order to do helpers, I have found that the new Groovy traits are awesome. And they make it great for doing this type of stuff because you're able to, what can you do in a trait? You can have default methods, right? So this is perfect because it allows us to define our trait for our helpers, and you can obviously have as many helpers as you want, and then just provide the specific implementation for Android and iOS that you're going to use. So I'm a huge proponent of using traits for doing this Groovy mobile stuff. So let's jump in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check out my new branch. Okay, and let's jump back to IntelliJ. The app is the exact same, so I won't show, the Android and iOS actual functionality is exactly the same. So on this one, I am going to show in this Gradle, just again with Gradle, you can do tasks with type and then pass in a specific type that you're going to be doing. And for this case, for only when we're doing test, I'm going to pull in 2 system properties, platform and locale. And that's just being pulled, it could be pulled from anywhere, but I'm going to do it just on the command line. But this is pretty important because this is how we're going to kick off different mobile test suites going forward. So this time we have BaseSpec, and this time it's just a simple switch. We're going to grab that platform, set up the appropriate desired capabilities with the appropriate stuff based on whatever value we passed in. If it's not iOS or Android, you know, we're going to just throw an exception. But keep in mind, this is I want to keep this a pretty simple example. One of the things we actually did when we were at the client doing this is we had a much more complex test runner that allowed us to pass in a locale, a language, a version, and it would set up an appropriate test runner based on that. So you can think of this as you can make it as complex as you want to make it, right? So for this, I'm just doing iOS and Android. I'm just hard coding the version. But iOS 8 launched yesterday, right? So I really should be running my tests on iOS 7 and iOS 8. Same thing with Android, right? You have different versions, hundreds of devices. So you can make this as complex as you want. But this is all we're doing just to keep the demo fairly straightforward. It's just a simple parameter for platform. OK, so that's an abstract class, so we need to implement it. Here's my hello world spec. Much simpler. It's just extending that base spec, and I have just simple things, simple helpers, which I'm going to show next. Simple, very simple tests.
You know, the first iteration of this, you had 2 tests.
Correct.
In the same run. Now, because you've taken that out and you have to run separately, you can't do them together.
Correct, and I'm actually going to talk about why I do that. That was I'll just repeat the comment here. Because I actually had 2 separate tests in the previous one, I was creating 2 separate desired capabilities objects. I was running them both at the same time. But I have found, I actually, the first time that I did this, I actually had it just like that, where I would kick off a test suite run, and it would run all the Android and all the iOS ones together. But what I found is that, actually, I can talk about it right now. Actually, so what I found is that what quickly happens is you have so many tests that you want to run, and you want to kick them off in parallel, that I've found keeping it, running your stuff, having multiple jobs in your Jenkins server to run the iOS and Android simultaneously if you have master-slave set up. Keeping them separate is actually desirable, because then you can specify them all as a different job, right? I want to have my iOS 7 job with English as the locale, and I want to test on an iPhone. That's like one job in Jenkins. Then I'm going to have my Android job with KitKat on a Nexus 5, right? So it's what I found. That's something we quickly learned is the test test suite becomes very complex, and I actually like just keeping it simple here. But the thing you'll also note in this code here is there's nothing about Android or iOS, right? It's meant purposely just to be h.text. I'm calling my helper, give me the text. And same down here. I'm sorry, button.click, and those 2 things that we had previously, the specific text field names, like I think it was Android widget edit text, and then UIA text edit or static text, or let's see, what was it again? Well, whatever, it doesn't matter. But the iOS term for a text field, you don't see that in here. So let's jump to our helpers. And in our base spec, we set up the Apple helper or the Android helper based on whichever one we're going to run. And once again, you could extend that to be Apple 7 helper, Apple 8 helper. And with Groovy traits, you could make as many of these as you want, because you have that common interface that can implement everything by default. So this is our helper class, the helper trait. Zoom in here. So this is everything common that we're using. Anytime we're just going to use the direct methods where there's no variation between OS, let's put it in a trait, right? That's our interface with default methods. So, back, selecting elements, tags, and then I have 4 abstract ones that I need to implement. Text and text exact, but I can also pass in an XPath expression or the name, or I can just call text, whatever. And then we just implement those specific methods in Apple helper and Android helper. So here you'll see that UIA text field, and in the Android one, here's where you'll see Android widget edit text. So once again, the Groovy traits make that pretty slick. So now, how do we run this? Let's do the same thing, Gradle Test, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in that system parameter once again, you would configure this in your Jenkins job, right? You would set up a job for every configuration that you want. You know, your mobile test suite could have 10 different Jenkins jobs. But for this demo, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do it on the command line. So I'm going to pass in platform equals iOS. So kicked up the same things, runs the same test, types in the name. It said Olo Roberto. It's going to now run the test for the invalid one, where it should say, it's just, you know, a simple example that the name we're going to put in there is not in the map that we created, so it says Ola Usted. It goes by pretty quick, but that's all it says is Ola Usted. If you let's run the app from Xcode here, and you can see it. So that's all it says. So it tested that, it worked great, and that passed. So now let's run the same thing, but let's use Android. So once again, this is going to fire up deploy the app to the Genymotion with our Nexus 5 Android emulator. Runs this first test, and now it should run the Usted test. Maybe. There we go. So there we go. Our test pass. So this is pretty cool. We're now to the point where we've written one Spock test with the help of some helpers and Groovy traits, and we have one test that is extremely simple syntax for Android, native Android and native iOS. So I think this is pretty cool. So, you know, in the native mobile space, the designs are always different. So anytime you can search based on an ID or a text string, you know, that's how you'll achieve that cross-platform mobile test. But I think this is pretty cool. So kind of imagine where this is going. We can now take this to the next level, and we can use more advanced Spock features. Well, not even really advanced, but just more cool Spock features. So let's check out the next demo. And this demo is just going to use the Spock's unroll. So this is just straight Spock. We're just going to pass in an expect where or where clause, and we're going to use unroll. So for this one, pull up the code, and there, oh, it popped up right away. So pretty much the same thing, but we're going to pass in all the values in that map that we had and make sure they work. So as this is going here, I'll just kind of keep talking about some of the key points and why this was pretty well received at where we were doing it. Is once again, this is the same binary that you would deliver to iTunes or Google Play. There's no difference. I didn't set up a separate test target, and that was huge for the QA team, right? They wanted to test the binary. They didn't want to test something separate. The development team would give them the APK, the IPA, and they would test it, and that was it. But it takes, kind of seeing this, it's like, wow, I just tested 10 scenarios that previously they're literally having people go in and click around on iOS and Android do. They weren't writing tests to do any of this, so they just saved themselves, literally hours that they were doing every time they were doing a release. So it's pretty cool, and it takes just kind of doing a quick demo for a QA team to see the benefits of that. But they'll be pretty resistant at first when you say you're going to try and automate their native mobile tests. But you can see it goes pretty quick, and you can do the same thing on actual real devices. And that desired capabilities, you would just set up the iOS device as opposed to the iOS simulator here. The other key thing to note is you'll keep seeing that the app starts fresh with every one. And obviously, that's a key component of testing, is right. You want to start with a clean state for every time you're doing this. So here I'm literally taking the app, blowing it away, reinstalling it. And this, there's ways to make this go a lot quicker. Then you're not going to want to be downloading this from a remote server thing. You're going to want to be publishing it to your Jenkins server that you're going to be running this on. But it doesn't take, iOS and Android are pretty quicker at installing these apps, and you do it from the command line like this. It doesn't take that long, and here we just ran through 10 tests on iOS. Or 11, maybe 12. How many did I have? That data table, or that, there we go. So then obviously you have all the benefits of Spock, right? Where you have, creates a nice report for you, and you can hand this off to a QA team and say, hey, it took me 2 minutes to execute all these tests, whereas something that would take people manually hours to do. Okay. So that's all fun, and it's cool to see that you can do stuff like that, but it's still extremely simple, right? Let's do something a little more fun. So another thing that is quite common for testing, manual testing in the mobile world, is changing locale and doing the same thing. So mobile apps, any big corporation has multilingual applications, multilingual websites, right? And doing this, finding testers to do this appropriately is extremely error prone and takes forever. Very few people in the software industry are very, can speak French, German, English, and Spanish all very well enough to open up an application. Maybe, I don't know, Yam, do you speak all of those? A bit of German? Okay. So finding somebody who's going to be able to correctly get a device, change the locales, type in all the strings appropriately, and get that to work is very error prone, and it takes a long time. I mean, are they literally going to look at a sheet and type in the French equivalent of hello? Or are they going to keep doing this? How else do you do a multilingual test of a mobile app if you're not doing something with automation? So let's do a demo. This demo is only going to work on iOS today. I did have kind of a workaround working for Android, but I won't show it in this demo. But that desired capabilities class that we looked at, it supports passing in a locale and a language. So I can, with 2 lines of code, change the entire locale for the device. And I never have to do this, and I can just, then I can have my translation team, most big companies, or if you're just using Google Translate or whatever service you're using to translate your text for your app, you'll have that in somewhere. Just set up your Spock test to read in that properties file for each language, and you can now test your app in all these languages. So this is a huge win for mobile automation. All right. I think yes, I'm on demo 4, and I'll pull up my locale spec. So since this is just iOS, I don't have that base spec. There's only one. But here you can see I'm expecting the greeting to not be null when I'm looking for welcome to the conference in English, willkommen auf der Konferenz. Is there any German speakers? Bienvenidos a la conferencia in Spanish. So I'm going to pass in the locale, and those are the, sorry, yeah, what is French? Let's see. I should have known. I should have added French in here. Oops. I won't worry about that. Like that? All right, there we go. So we now have 4 language tests that are going to say, welcome to the conference. And since this is iOS only, I don't have to pass in the platform anymore. Kind of a funny story about doing this. Make sure you know how to change the locale of your device before you change it to Chinese or a language that you can't recognize. I had that happen to me, and let me tell you, it was quite interesting. So, well, the test is going here. So there's German. This should be our Spanish one. There we go. And you can see the locale is changing by the upper left-hand corner. You'll see it, this it'll say whatever French is, aperture. How do you say that? Aperture? Aperture, yeah. Oh, something failed. Ah. Verifying FR greeting is displayed. No such element. What happened here? Oh, I'm sorry. We'd have to do a quick change. I should have thought about that. I can add it to the test, but hey, my test pass, I don't have my front. Actually, this is a perfect example of test-driven development. I have the value in there, but I do not have the actual string in my project. So we can close project, and we can open my locale demo project. And if I go to my localized strings, you can see I have German, English, and Spanish. So let's add another locale, and I'm trying to remember how I did that. Localization, I thought it was a plus here. Can't remember how I add a locale to a, well, anyway. I won't do that. But anyway, that's why the test failed here. If we, I would have to rebuild the Xcode app with that string in the Xcode app. That's what's wrong.
What's the error message like, when the test failed?
Yep, it's right here. It's so verify FR greeting is displayed. It says no such element exception. So that's what it'll say, no such element exception at locale spec. So what that is telling us is in our tests, I'll just wait for this to be done here.
We don't get any Spock errors.
Okay, so our test was successful once I removed that. But anyway, so the question was, what error do you get back? You are correct in that the error is not, the typical Spock syntax is, you get the nice little tree of values that are wrong. What is actually happening here, though, it's going to depend on your test that you write. So in this particular one, it's saying no such element exception. That's not very helpful at all, is it, to the gentleman's point? That's actually, what happened? How come that didn't work? What's actually happening is when I did this, it was looking for an element with this. So it's literally saying, find the text based on that greeting, and that's all the information we gave Appium to say, you should find the greeting that says, welcome to the conference in French. And Appium's just like, I couldn't find it. That's all I got for you. So it is correct. It's not the best error message, right? Because no such element, it's not too helpful, but if it does give you the line number, at least you can go in and you can see what was wrong. But that is true. Okay, so now we have Appium working with locale. So once again, that's a huge win, being able to do that. And before I forget, oops. What's going on here? Sorry, my Mac is freaking out here. There we go. Before I forget, I'm going to jump back and do exactly what I was just talking about and change the locale back on my iOS simulator because it's still going to be in Spanish here. So I'm going to change the language back, and I'm also going to change the locale. So you can see it set the language and the actual region format. That region format is the second part here of the, right here, the ES. The capital one is going to be the region format. Okay. Done with that. All right, let's jump back to Keynote.
You should be able to do it for the test itself, right? The code itself.
Yes, absolutely. You can reset. You could always reset the locale in your test. Absolutely. I just didn't for whatever reason. But once again, if you are doing Chinese or something that you do not recognize and you don't have the locations memorized in your iOS or Android settings, you're in a tough spot and you're gonna do some Googling. Okay, so now let's just do a slightly more complex demo. So this is my account spec, trying to simulate more of a real world situation besides just looking for a welcome to the conference label. But this one, this is a very common thing, right? I'm going to test for blank passwords, make sure a password and a password confirmation are the same, stuff like that. So for this one, we'll just jump to the code real quick. And this is data entry. So in this one, you can see I'm going to, I'm going to see if, this is objective C, I'm going to see if the identifier is equal to the results, and just like you have an intent, which is like passing data from one activity in Android to the next activity, that's called a segue in iOS to pass between view controllers. So it's just different terminology. Unfortunately, it can be confusing if you do both. But so should perform segue with identifier is going to be called for us here, and we can say, is the password text field length equal to 0? Well, if so, call my display password as blank, which is right here, and that's just going to display a message, a prompt that says message is blank. And similarly, if the password text field is not the same as confirm password text field, then call our display passwords do not match, which is up here. So pretty basic, but once again, just trying to simulate a little bit more complex screen with some inputs and some pop-ups and stuff, just to show that this is perfectly doable. It's kind of it's up to your imagination how far you want to take this, but for demo purposes, wanted to have something just a little bit more complex. Okay, so data entry. So this is in Android. And I still need to switch over to Android Studio. So Android Studio is the IntelliJ version of Android development. I just haven't switched over yet, but need to do that. But this is still the Eclipse Android Development Studio, and I'm looking for this right here. So this is the exact same thing as the Objective-C, but it's just Java, right? So create account, we're going to do those same 2 checks, password confirmation and password blank. If not, we're going to create that intent right here, and from there, sorry, you can't really see that. If not, we'll create that intent with our welcome message and so forth. So pretty simple Android and Objective-C code. Let's run our application so you can see what it looks like. I'm sorry, run our test so you can see what it looks like. And I'm going to check out my new branch. Okay, so now I can check out my demo 5 branch. There we go. And what we'll do is we are going to run this one. And since we're back to a test that is going to do both, we're going to run it with that platform stuff again. And actually, before I run it, sorry, let me show you the test. So we're back to having a base spec. We have our helpers still. And the account spec, this is what it looks like. Create account for name. So with Spock, you can use that on roll, and it'll pass in and use the name. So when you're in your reports, you'll have that information in there. And you just pass in the name, email, password. I'm passing in all the values here to this method. I'm going to grab the inputs. I'm going to click the button that says create account. And then I'm going to assert that welcome, comma, name, whatever they pass in the name, does not equal null. So once again, the same gentleman that said the question about the kind of unfriendly error message that's going to be thrown, it's going to be the same here because we're looking for an element based on a name, right? That text helper is just looking for that element on the screen. If it doesn't find it, well, it's just going to say element not found exception. But that helper text is once again going to go, take that string and do it per platform for us here, because we don't have, that's an abstract class or abstract method in our trait. Okay, so I just passed in 3 values here. You can see that password and confirm password are both having values and they're both the same. So all 3 of those should test. All 3 of those should pass because the value, based on the business logic we set up, we should be good. Our next test, blank password pop-up should appear. So here, I'm just going to click the button. I'm not going to provide any value. And based on our Objective-C and Java logic, we should get a pop-up. It says password is blank. You can't have a null password. And obviously, you probably want that for all of them, all the fields. And then we have our passwords do not match pop-up should appear for, once again, we'll pass in the name. So in our Spock report, we know which one we're referring to. But here, we're going to say passwords do not match based on a name and email. And you can see we just have 2 test cases. One where one letter is different, it's a capital P, and one where it's blank. There's no value. So let's run this. So I'll do it on iOS first. All right, starts up our simulator. Here's our application. Types in everything for us. We have our password fields. That test succeeded. It goes pretty quick, obviously, but it's just asserting that it says welcome, Bobby, or whatever that test was. It looks for that string. It finds it. Test succeeded. We're good. So it's going to do the same thing based on all those values we had in our Spock test. That the unroll, once again, this is all driven by that unroll annotation on the Spock test to execute that test based on the values that we're providing in the where part of the Spock test. What is the correct name for that? Where, like the expect? Where is it? The expect section? Expect label? Expect where? Expect block. So in the where block, that's where all these values are coming from. I can't remember how many I had in there. Was it just 3? Oh, so there's the password is blank test. And now we should have, there's I think 2 passwords do not match tests. So once again, I mean, you can imagine, let's say that this was a real sign-up form for something, your business. And you have 3 locales, so you're doing French, Spanish, and English. And you want to test it with 5 different data sets. Well, I mean, literally, most people are paying people to go in and type all this in manually and change the locale and do this. So like very quickly, you can see the huge benefit of being able to do this. Let's run that. So that finished. Everything was successful. Actually, before I run it again, let's take a look at how long it took. Build report. No. Yeah. So obviously, tracks everything for us. In our count spec, we had these tests, and this is just what I wanted to show with that unroll annotation. You get the actual name in there. So create account for Alexander, Bobby, George. And altogether, it took us just under 2 minutes to run all of our tests on iOS. So that's not too bad. Let's run the same thing, but on Android. And I did something with this one just to illustrate another point here that I'll talk about. Here, I'm not a designer, as you can tell by my demo app. But what's the difference between this one and the iOS one? Well, in this one, I have actual labels that say name, email, password, confirm password. In the iOS one, I had those just be hints on the text fields. So there were no labels. It would say Bobby, and then when you tapped that field, it would erase so you could type your name. So this is my simple and dumb example of a design change. between iOS and Android to show that your same test, you're going to have different designs, right? Android designs are different than iOS designs. And you can still write a test that's going to do multiple things. It's how you build your helpers, right? Are you going to look based on an Xcode path? Are you going to look based on like the create account label in different languages? There's multiple different ways you can grab the elements on the screen, but this is just meant to show that I can have a different design and still have the same test work. I think this is the last one, right? Maybe the password is blank, should be next. Maybe? Nope, I do another one here. So it definitely does take a little bit of time for the JVM running our Gradle, running our tests to take the test, send it to the Appium driver, and then Appium then takes that value and then sends it to UI automation, which in turn finds the actual element and then sends it. So I mean, it does take a little bit to go back and forth, but you're going to be running this all on a CI server anyway, so you're not going to be sitting here watching this like we're doing right now. But the key thing the argument that I would make, the key argument is this is still, regardless of how long it takes for them to find the actual fields and usually puts the values in pretty quick. It just takes a little bit to find them. It's still a lot quicker than people typing around or manually doing this. And like I said, you're going to be doing this on your CI server. You're not going to be sitting here watching this anyway.
Can you show the screenshots?
Yes, you can. Actually, I couldn't include that code. That was some proprietary code that we wrote for the client, but it was really simple, actually. We had a function that would take a screenshot at everything, and then if a Spock test was failing, we would include we kind of adapted the Spock report that's created, and we would include screenshots if the test failed. If it succeeded, we don't care. We don't need screenshots. But if it failed, we could see exactly, well, you're looking for create account. It says create account, right? There's no T. So it would take that screenshot for you and put it in there. But yeah, that was at our client site. WebDriver has that as a, okay. So I'll have to let you know, that's a good, I should look at the docs to see if Appium has included that in the latest versions. Yeah? Yeah, show me the screen. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, how else am I going to know what happened, right? No, that's definitely. Okay, looks like our tests are done here. Build successful, so let's go to that. Yep, I still have it up. So iOS took 2 minutes, and I can see all the times for each individual test. I'll refresh. Android took a little bit longer, took 3 minutes and 30 seconds, but that's still not bad for running password checks and password to null, and then creating the account for 3 people. That's not too bad. Okay, let's jump back to the slides here. So I've mentioned continuous integration a couple times now. Obviously, that's hugely important in multiple aspects of your mobile development. This has definitely gotten a lot more interest from Apple in the past year. Before WWDC last year, it was almost kind of hilarious how little Apple was giving developers in terms of continuous integration, testing. Like there was nothing in this space, right? And now they've bought TestFlight, they've introduced Xcode bots, so it's definitely getting a lot better, but it's still kind of, I mean, in the Groovy landscape here, Groovy community here, we've been doing this stuff for years, right? This is nothing new, but just wanted to call it out. Like it is still fairly new, and not very many people are doing this for iOS. But for Android, you're going to have your Jenkins build set up to just build your Android application, build your APK file, sign it, zip align it, just like you would do in Eclipse or Android Studio now. Obviously, you're going to have your Jenkins server do that for you. Been the best practice for years, nothing new. Xcode, like I was just talking about, it's brand new at WWDC last year. It works fairly good. It does take a while to get that set up, just because it's a new CI server. It's not just like adding a plugin to Jenkins, right? It is a new CI server, but it's definitely the way to go going forward. I previously used to have kind of goofy Jenkins setup where I was building iOS apps with Jenkins on a Mac Mini, and it was just a big mess. So I don't recommend using Jenkins for iOS anymore. People were doing it, but now that Xcode Bots is out there, I'd recommend that be your iOS server. What I will say though is run these two in the same box. Do both your Jenkins builds and your Xcode builds, your Android builds and iOS builds on a Mac Pro or Mac Mini. Set it up, and that's just your mobile continuous integration server. And the best practice that way you have one spot that's doing all your signing. You have your keys. You'll have your provisioning profiles for iOS, your key store for Android. Get that box set up, and that's your mobile CI server. For the test suites, I talked about this a couple times, but once again, this is just a straight Groovy project, right, with a Gradle. So once again, we're going to be in Jenkins, and I would strongly recommend setting up jobs for each individual test suite that you're going to, or like a platform that you're going to be testing. We had this all together, like I mentioned. It was a pretty cool test runner that we had that was, automatically would pick up your test configurations. But I think that there's no reason that you're going to want to. There's no reason not to split them out and just pass in. This is my platform that I want. I want English on iPhone with iOS 7. I want French on iPad with iOS 8, right? And just have those be jobs. And you can set it. It's really easy to set up Jenkins master slaves, and you can execute these all in parallel. You saw it took 3 minutes and 30 seconds to run 10 tests on Android. You could very quickly have 1,000 tests, that you're going to be doing, based once you get going on, total number of tests based on all the configurations and locales and everything. You're definitely going to want to run these in parallel. Typically you're going to run these, overnight, and it may take a couple hours. But if you don't run them in parallel, they're not even going to be done by the time people come into the office, or if you're, doing development in multiple countries. So this is just a sample for iOS, and imagine all the Android possibilities. Okay. iOS simulators and Android emulators, we kind of talked about this a little bit. There's definitely limitations with using iOS simulator. You can't do a lot of stuff. Once again, it's not an actual iOS operating system, right? The iOS simulator is just an app on the Mac. It's not an actual iOS device, unlike an Android emulator is the full Android operating system, right? So it's a key difference. So because of that, you're going to want to test on real devices, always. Always test on real devices for iOS. For Android, you can, I've had a lot of success using this Genymotion emulator. It's incredibly fast. I'm not, full disclosure, I haven't played around with Android Studio too much. I still have been kind of using the old Eclipse Android development tools. Maybe the Android Studio emulators are better. Maybe they've fixed this up, but the Android emulator with the Eclipse environment is awful. It is probably the worst thing ever. It is so slow, and it is ridiculous. So there's certain hardware acceleration things that you can do, but I'd recommend just go getting Genymotion. Once again, it's free for personal use, unless they've changed license recently, and there's a corporate version you can buy for your team. But yeah, you can saw it starts up pretty quick, and it gives you just a huge advantage in doing Android development. Yeah. It doesn't do Wi-Fi. There's another huge. That's a good thing to call out too. So yeah, like I said, thanks. That's good to know too. I'm hoping that they've made Android Studio better with the whole emulator situation, but I haven't tried it myself, so I can't comment. But we know that we have to test on real devices, right? Because iOS doesn't get us even close to where the Android emulator is going to get us, but we have to test on real devices. So you have two options, right? You can literally plug in devices to your CI server, and nothing wrong with that. It just kind of depends on what you're doing. But let's say you're in a big company and everybody's going to have an iPad with iOS 7 or iOS 8. If you're big corporations, they're rolling out apps to hundreds of devices. Yeah, you could just have a couple devices plugged in, and you're running your device from your Mac Mini or Mac Pro. But that's pretty limited. The next best thing is you can use a device provider, right? So these are becoming more and more popular, and I'm sure there's lots more that have become available even recently, but Sauce Labs is a company that provides, I think they actually are contributors to Appium, or there's some sort of relationship between Sauce Labs and Appium. I'm not sure of the exact details, but Sauce Labs is a company that you can rent devices from. So you can run your tests on devices on their cloud of devices. And I'm not sure of exactly all the technical stuff that they have, how that's working, but you can what I do know is you can define your configurations. You can say, I want iOS 7, iOS 8, iPhone 5s, iPhone 6s, and iPad minis. And it'll then run all your tests on those devices for you and give you the test report back. So it's pretty cool. I used a different product that did the exact same thing, and it worked fairly well. But Sauce Lab seems to be kind of the go-to one for Appium stuff. So it's definitely the way to go. And once again, the key thing here is you're going to want to run your tests in parallel. You want to get this going on 10 devices, get it going immediately, so it only takes a couple hours and not 10 hours. Okay, so that's Groovy Mobile Automation. That's the technology, libraries, tools. You saw some demos. Where do we go from here? What are just some things that I can provide for additional tidbits? The first thing I would do, starting any new mobile project, is define a testing contract with your stakeholders. And once again, this was a new world for me coming into this. I've never really been in the QA function before, and what I found is this is really important. So you don't have people come back to you after and say, well, this doesn't work on my device. Well, what is your device? What's your test configuration? Let's go back. Do this first. Define what your testing contract is going to be. Here's the devices I'm testing. Here's the OS versions I'm testing. Here's exactly what our plan is. Get that all set up with your CI server. Never worried about it again. So you don't have people coming back to you after the fact, coming back to your QA team going, what's going on here? A couple things to note about this. A lot of people will still say you have to test Android 2.3. It still actually does have, I looked this morning actually to make sure I had the right number. It still is 13% market share. That blows me away actually, that Android 2.3 is, what's that? Oh man. I mean, that's fascinating. How old is Android 2.3? I mean, it's so old. But for automation, there was such a drastic change in starting with 4.0, right? I'd recommend drawing the line in the sand saying, for any mobile automation testing we're doing, it's 4.0 or up. We're not going to worry about the old gingerbread stuff. 4.0 and up, because otherwise the actual underlying library, the UI Automator library on Android, is extremely different between those, and you'll run into some inconsistencies and issues. And it's best to just draw a line in the sand saying 4.0 and up for our automation efforts. You can still support 2.3 if you want in your app, but I mean, I think even the recommendation now is to build an app that only supports 4.0 and up. So at least that's what Ken just said in his talk. So that's what I'm going with. For iOS, this is obviously very different. If you have an iPhone, you know this, but people update extremely quickly. I don't have iOS 8 on my phone today, but that's only because we're on hotel Wi-Fi, and I didn't want to download it on hotel Wi-Fi. So when I get home, I'm going to update to iOS 8. I mean, iOS just seems to be updating at a much quicker pace than the Android communities. And that's obviously driven because you only have one hardware manufacturer, right? It's extremely easy. With Android, you have so many different hardware manufacturers, it's not possible, right? So it's nothing against Android, that's just how it is. But N and N-1, so you only never need to support 2 versions with your iOS automation tests. Today, that's iOS 7 and 8 for anything new you're starting. Previously, obviously, iOS 7 and iOS 6. Okay. As part of a testing contract, the other thing that I have found lesson learned is I would define what the goal is for automated testing. Because the term automated testing, not just mobile, like just automated testing in general, it's like buzzwords in the QA community. It's crazy. Like just like Agile or DevOps or automated testing. Oh my God, that's the best thing ever in the QA communities. And you have to be very careful that it doesn't get taken out of context, because you'll be talking to somebody in a QA function, and you'll say, yep, we're doing automated testing. They're like, oh, well, we never have to test anything again. Everything's automated. We're good. You're going to solve all of our problems and world hunger and everything with our automated testing. So what I would always do as part of defining your test contract at the start of your QA project, I would say, what is the goal of our automated testing? Not we're just going to do it, but what is the actual goal? Are we going to automate a certain % of function points or a certain % of user stories? That's okay. What I would actually do is I would say, what is the % of test cases currently being run by the QA manual testers that we're going to automate? because your user stories can explode into numerous different tests. But if you say I actually ran it. I screwed up this. I said, well, we can automate 50% of user stories as an example, without thinking about how many different tests that actually was based on the user stories. So definitely start with saying, what's our current test case count look like? How many locales, how many devices? What are you currently doing today in manual testing for an app? And pick a percentage of those that you're going to try and automate. That's how I would define your goal for automated testing. Don't ever just say, we're going to automate mobile testing. So what else? What else besides defining a contract? The other big thing that I would recommend is establish a mobile testing strategy. This is something we debated a lot back and forth. In my example, I was testing some simple data input, right? I'm going to create an account with Bobby and Warner and Bobby at my email and my password, right? But what is always happening, right? You're always calling an API. There's usually very little logic in a mobile app. You're calling the API, creating the request, getting the response, presenting it. So what you'll run into with mobile automated testing is, what APIs can you really trust? And which APIs can't you trust? And it almost got to the point where we found that we couldn't rely on some APIs. We wanted to build in testing that would account for that. But at the same time, we're adding a lot of complexity to a mobile test suite, when really we should be defining a automated test suite for the API, right? We should have a full run of automated testing for the tests, doing all the things that we want to do with their API. So think about that with your testing strategy. Is like, well, do I trust this API or do I not trust this API? If so, if I don't trust it, well, how many test permutations should I run with that API so I can trust it? Whereas if it's something I know that it works, it's good, it's solid, they have their own automated tests, I just need to validate that the connection works essentially, right? And I get the appropriate response, but you don't have to evaluate all the responses that it can send. So next, as part of your mobile testing strategy, I would say, what takes the most time testing your app today? And focus on that. So as part of, besides just thinking about automating a certain number of test cases, what is the biggest hindrance? Because that's going to be the biggest bang for your buck. Is it the language-based stuff? A lot of times that's going to be it, right? That's such a huge thing in today's world, is building multilingual apps and testing that all the strings are correct, that all the display, it displays in French and German correctly. That's a huge win to be able to automate that, anything with that. Any manual input you're gonna get a win with. But just think about what takes the most time. And also, I would think about how to find the right balance of mobile testing. So this is code just like anything else, right? We're writing code. We're writing test cases in Spock and Groovy. And don't get me wrong, Spock and Groovy is great. We're getting a lot of stuff for very little code. In our code, it's not, we're pretty good. It's pretty short with our helpers and everything, but it's still code, right? We're still writing code, and writing code is the cheapest thing. Maintaining code is what is expensive, right? Everybody knows that. So how do you find the right balance? I don't want to just be writing thousands and thousands of lines of mobile automation test code, and all of a sudden I have this huge, massive code base of tests that takes me forever to update, and all of a sudden they're changing the app and it broke 50% of my tests. Well, how much value am I really getting out of that, right? So focus on the time it's going to take to write these versus what you're going to get out of it. Is it a stable part of the app that it's not going to be changing a lot, that you want to validate all the inputs and everything? So it's just another thing to think about. Next, as part of your testing strategy, I would think about decoupling your components. This is very similar to the previous point around what APIs you can trust and what you can't. But really just think about your mobile application as any other enterprise application, right? The only difference is, instead of having an Angular front end or an Ember front end, you have an iOS front end and an Android front end. So your APIs are part of your application. Your Android app and your iOS app will not function without these other systems, right? So they're obviously very important, but you can't ever test everything in one thing. So you need to decouple the components, and you can still run the tests together, but focus on testing them separately whenever possible. And this goes to, I've kind of been saying this all along, but automation investment pays for itself. So if you think about a really simple example, let's say I have 50 tests, 3 locales on 7 platforms, we're already over 1,000 tests. I mean, it goes exponentially higher here with mobile because there's so many different configurations. So I would argue that the biggest benefit of doing mobile automation testing is it's a regression test, right? I'm not testing the new stuff that the engineers are building last week, right? I mean, you're not going to get a benefit out of doing that. Taking a build and, a lot of people will say, I take the build and I write the tests immediately, and well, I don't think that's the biggest bang for the buck because they could change it in a week, right? What you want to focus on is what are the stable parts of the app, build up the regression test suite so that I have this functionality, I know it's stable, and now I'm going to make sure that I never break that. I'm never going to break this part of my app. So automation, obviously, it allows us to run all our regression tests daily. Huge win as part of our QA effort. So call to action. I decided to throw in a call to action. Obviously, you're at the conference because you like Groovy and you came here because you like mobile automation or you've heard about it and you want to do it. So write one functional test case. And it doesn't have to be iOS or Android if you're, whatever you can do, but write one test case to validate one piece of business functionality. Whether that's whatever your company app is, just one simple thing, and show it to your QA department and see their reaction. I think you'll discover that they'll be very resistant at first because, oh my gosh, it's code and I don't do code because I'm a QA tester. But once they see the time that can be saved by one business function, automating that, like just testing one thing with different locales or testing one screen with 10 different inputs with a Spock unroll annotation, I think if they see that once, they'll be hooked. And from there on out, you can have fun writing Spock tests, automating your iOS and Android apps. So thank you very much for coming to the Mobile Automation with Groovy talk. Appreciate you guys being here. And obviously, thank you to the Spring 1.2GX organizers and sponsors. Thank you very much. It's great to be at the conference. And now I'll open it up to questions.
Do we have access to the code by any chance?
Yes, I'm going to push the code for my demo suite up to my GitHub repo. Yep. And I'll be sending the slides to, actually, I'll throw the link to the GitHub repo in this on maybe the first page or the last page here. And I know that the organizers are collecting all the information and putting it somewhere, so I'll make sure the link is in here. But it'll just be on GitHub. Yep. Yeah?
Question about when you change the language on your simulated device and your emulated device,
Mm-hmm.
why did that get stuck? Like, couldn't you blow that away and restart the device so it would come back to like the default script, or was it that you?
That's a very good question. So the question was, I'll repeat it for the video. If you are changing the locale language or area in a test, why did that persist on the iOS simulator? And that's a great question. The answer is because that's outside of the app. So your iOS simulator is trying to mimic a device, right? Or an Android emulator is an Android operating system. The location settings, the settings for locale, they're a device setting, not an app setting. And what we're doing as part of our Spock test is we're blowing away the app and reinstalling the app. So that's a good point, though, because it's a good thing to call out because there are certain device capabilities that you can do like that. Because it's such an important one, there was emphasis on that. There are certain other device things that you can't do. I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but there are certain device things that you can't control within a test, but this is one of them that it's outside of the app. Typically, your test is going to be everything within your APK or your IPA, but locale and region are outside, and that's why they persist with the simulator, because I'm only blowing away the app between each test iteration. I'm not going and touching the phone. I'm just blowing away the uninstalling, installing.
Could you have shut down the simulator altogether?
So it is shutting down the simulator, but the simulator will keep the settings that you have. So let me just do a quick demo here, and I can show you. It saves the state of the. I think it was 4 is the locale one. Yes. So as an example, so here I'm passing in the locale for EN, DN, and ES, and it sets that locale. But I could just as easily have this cleanup method. I could set it back to English.
Yeah, and clean up again.
Yep. So if it's honestly probably a good idea. So you don't run into the problem that I ran into. But in cleanup, I could write some code here that would do the equivalent of reset my device back to English, back to region United States, or whichever region that you're testing in. I would just do it in the cleanup method is what I would do. Any other questions? All right, great. Well, thanks for coming to the talk. Hope you enjoyed it. And hope you guys can write some Groovy mobile automation tests.